Welcome to the 5th VEMBU tutorial. Today we will cover receiver and sensor deployments and retrievals. This is a big one, so grab a snack. Open your copy of the VEMBU. By now, hopefully you are feeling comfortable navigating the VEMBU interface. On the Deployments List tab, there is a deployment button, a retrieval button, and a sensor-only deployment and retrieval button. The deployment and receiver buttons are used if you are entering information on a receiver deployment or retrieval. It can be just a receiver or a receiver and sensor, but there has to be a receiver. The sensor-only button is used if you're deploying or retrieving a sensor by itself, no receiver associated with it, even if it is at a receiver station. Why break them up? To make life easier. If you deploy and retrieve a receiver and sensor together, the VEMBU can use the information to populate different fields. That means less data entry for you. But receivers and sensors may not always be tied together. But maybe you don't retrieve the sensor every time you retrieve the receiver, or maybe you retrieve the sensors on a different schedule. We'll walk through a couple of examples. Go ahead and select the Deployments button. A pop-up window appears. The first drop-down is for station. Only active stations are available for deployment. If a station is retired, it will no longer appear in this list. This is one of the first QA/QC rules. Sometimes when stations are retired or moved, people remember the old name, anything like that. That helps keep everything the same and more accurate. The second drop-down is for receiver number. The drop-down contains all on-shelf receivers. That is another QA/QC rule. If a receiver is lost or broken or already deployed, it will not be available in this list. This helps from trying to deploy a receiver at 2 different locations at once. If the receiver number on the datasheet is not in this list, the record cannot be entered. The initialized date time is the date time that the receiver was initialized. Makes sense. The deployed date and time is the date and time the receiver actually touched the water. You can use this to kick out any accidental detections before the receiver was deployed in the place you said it was. The time zone is defaulted to Eastern. Battery life, if you like to record battery life, you can put it here. On all these forms, the variables that are mandatory for the output and being fed into the node are marked with an asterisk. See, battery life is not marked with an asterisk, so this is up to you. Latitude and longitude are automatically populated from the station metadata. Status is defaulted as deployed. Please don't change this. If you deployed a sensor at the same time, you can go ahead and enter the information here. We will go ahead and add a sensor. And since it's our example here was a hobo, I'm going to put in how we set the sampling frequency to take a temperature every 1 hour. Comments are freeform. If you have a receiver that has an internal tag associated with it, you can go ahead and fill in this information, whether it's on or off, the interval, and the power. When you are done, hit save. If you don't want to save, select the Close Without Saving button. This is really important. You don't want to accidentally save partial records. It will change the status of the equipment. If you just use this little X up here, it will automatically save. So again, if you don't want to save, then select this button. We are done with this deployment, so I will select Save. Do you want to save this record? Yes. I will go ahead and add one more deployment. I want to point out with serial number, notice how that first receiver that we deployed, 111, is no longer available. I only have 3 receivers on the shelf. I have added in a second deployment, and I hit Save and Close. Notice how the deployment list is automatically updated with some shortened version of the information. So here we have the station, the receiver number, the deploy date and time, and the status. At this point, we've done our first deployment and successfully entered the data. Now we're going to have to jump forward in time in the future, and you are ready for another round of downloading. To simulate this forward jump in time, I'm just going to minimize, and now time passes, and you're ready to go back out in the field. You can go ahead and open up your copy of the VEMBU. The VEMBU can offer useful information before going in the field. Click here on our Queries tab. Perhaps you wanted to know the last time you were at the stations. Go ahead and click date last at station. This will tell us the last time that someone was physically present at that station. So here are the two the two deployment dates, and C and D, these are the two dates that we said we established that station. You can go ahead and right click and close. Perhaps you're wondering, when was the last time you changed batteries? You can go ahead and click date of last battery change. All the receivers come up, the date of the last battery change, and this is auto-calculated to the current date. Go ahead and close. Maybe you forgot what receivers you deployed. You go ahead and look at deployed receivers. Here again, we have the stations, receiver numbers, and when they were deployed. You can do the same thing for sensors as well. Perhaps your question is, what do I have on the shelf to be deployed? Essentially, how many downloads can I go do? We can look at on-shelf receivers. We have 2 receivers on the shelf since we've deployed 2. As an added bonus, we have a summary sheet for field work. So this is a series of useful information, and this is all kept to be current. This is all current. So you have the station, latitude, longitude, the receiver number that's there, their sensor number that's there, the last time the battery was changed on the sensor, attachment methods so that you can take whatever you need to in the field, equipment-wise, the description, and some other useful information. All right, you've answered your questions. Now it's time for field work. Field work went really fast, and now we have the data sheets. Go ahead on over back to the deployment list tab. It doesn't matter what you enter first, the deployment or retrieval at a station, unless you are picking up and putting down the same receiver. Remember, on the deployment form, it only has on-shelf receivers, so you can't deploy a receiver again without first telling the VEMBU it was retrieved. Think of it like a library book. It can't get loaned again, even to the same person, before it is returned. Go ahead and select Retrievals. A new pop-up window appears. From the first drop-down, select the station or receiver you retrieved. If this combo does not match the data sheet, you should not enter the record. You need to go back and see if an error was made when the deployment happened. Several boxes auto-populate. Yay, that's good. That means less typing. So here we can change from receiver recovered, this could be a yes, no, or data downloaded, yes, no. Retrieval date and time is the date and time the receiver physically came out of the water. This is also another QA/QC rule. The retrieval time must be after the deployment date and time. Now, it may sound silly, but think how easy it is just to mess up one number in the year. But if I try, I will get an error message. The retrieval date must be after the deployment date. That makes me aware that I need to go back and re-examine this. Also, if I don't fill out this date time in its entirety, see here I've left off seconds, it will tell me that I need to go back and use the formatting. Again, time zone is defaulted to Eastern. This is a piece of information just to you that's auto-calculated, and that's the number of days deployed for that receiver. Battery life, again optional. The download date and time. A few of these variables, including file name, ping, syncs, date stopped recording, are from the VRL event log. You can either enter the information now, or I will cover how to go back and fill it in the next tutorial on editing records. You can imagine you may want a system where the basic data are entered quickly, like what we've done here. Then you can go back on a cloudy or non-field day to fill in the rest. We retrieved the sensor along with the receiver, so we're going to enter the information down here. Just like up above, you have a drop-down with a combination of the sensor and station code. I'm going to go ahead and add the sensor download date and time. If we did not retrieve the sensor along with the receiver, then we would have left this blank. In this last box, it asks for the receiver retrieval ID. That is this number up here. And you go ahead and just type that in. That ID shows that the sensor was retrieved in association with the receiver. Comments are freeform. If you are done, click Save. If you do not want to save the record, click Close without saving. Again, it is very important not to use this little X if you want to exit without saving. We are done with this record, so I will go ahead and select Save. It's going to ask if you want to save this record, yes, and you're about to update one row, yes. Notice how the status on the deployment list changes. As you can imagine, this list can get very long very quickly. I prefer to filter so I only see currently deployed receivers. So I'm right-clicking on this, or I'm clicking on this little arrow next to status. And just like in Excel or other programs, you can use a filter. And I'm going to filter it just for deployed. Following how data sheets are normally filled out, we will deploy a receiver at the same station. Select the Deployments button. Since we did this just a few minutes ago, I'm going to pause and fill in the information. What I do want to show you is the receiver serial number. Since we just retrieved receiver 111, it's now available to be redeployed, as well as the 2 receivers I had on the shelf. Super fast typing. Notice I left the sensor area blank. We did not deploy a sensor with this receiver. Maybe we forgot to bring it on the boat. Things happen. Click Save and Close. Again, notice how the deployment list changes. Let's pretend we decided to deploy a sensor at station AAAA a few days later. Since there is no receiver associated with the deployment, we select the sensor only in deployments and retrievals. Notice how it is very similar to the deployment list. Again, we have the stations, sensor numbers, non-receiver stations I'll talk about in a minute, but that if it's a non-receiver station, or you don't have a receiver there, the deploy date and time, and the status of the sensor. We're going to go ahead and select deployments. We're going to fill out this form, much like what we did with the receivers. The first drop-down is the sensor serial number. This will only have on-shelf sensors. So this is 555, the one that was just retrieved, and then 777 that stayed on the shelf. The sensor sampling frequency is how often you've set it up to take an environmental sample. For us, again, we tend to use 1 hour. Deployment date and time is just like with the receiver. That is the date and time that the sensor physically went into the water. The deploy date time is, again, defaulted to Eastern. Feel free to change it. The station, this is a drop down that will only be active stations, and you can select it if you're deploying the receiver to a station that typically have a receiver. Now, sometimes it happens where people have environmental sensors out, not necessarily in association with their receiver. If that is the case, so you've just put, say, a water temperature probe out somewhere, and it's not at one of your receiver stations, you can make up a code for whatever you want to call that. And it says down here, create code if not associated with the receiver station. And then you will have to write in the latitude and longitude in decimal degrees. But for us, we are actually going to deploy this at a receiver station. And those fields are auto-populated. I leave this non-receiver station blank. Sensor status is defaulted to deployed. Please don't change that. Comments are free form. And if we're done, we can go ahead and click Save. And if you want to do the same sort of filtering like we did in the deployment list, you can go ahead and click on the little arrow next to sensor status. You just want to see deployed. And those are all sensors that are currently deployed. Let's check on our queries and see how they've changed. Navigate to the Query tab on top. How about what kind of equipment we have on the shelf now? Here we see we have 2 receivers on the shelf, automatically updated. And we have 1 sensor on the shelf. All the queries are automatically updated, so no need to run any additional code or sorting, cutting, and pasting. That completes the 5th tutorial on deployments and retrievals. In the next tutorial, we will cover how to edit records. On a personal note, if you're interested in the VEMBU but get a little sick to your stomach thinking of having to go back and add old records, it's not as bad as you think. First, it doesn't take as long as you might think. We have an array of around 60 receivers downloaded roughly 3 times a year. I entered a year's worth of deployments and retrievals in 3 not-so-full days. Second, you can pick a point to start with the VEMBU. For us, we started in 2016. It gets a little weird because you won't be able to enter retrievals that were deployed before 2016. But start with deployments and then work forward. That allows you to start using the VEMBU now, and you can add in the earlier deployments and retrievals when time allows. Thank you very much, and I'll see you in the next tutorial.